just to begin, and we'll start with you, Jeff, what would your response be to what you heard Katharine say?
Thank you very much for being here, everybody, and on behalf of Regent, we're delighted that you're here and to be a part of this whole conversation. The last name, Greenman, you couldn't get a better name for this. So I'm here on account of my name, not any expertise or any other quality, I think, for this. Well, I mean, wonderful talk. Thank you very much. I just want to maybe pick up where you left off. As an educator, you're an educator. Regent's an educational institution. There are many educators here tonight. I'm just struck by your appeal to the transformation of the heart. And you've given us data and information, but in a sense, it's ultimately an appeal that you're making to us to care, for compassion, for empathy, and ultimately for love. And love in a deeply Christian sense, you're talking about a love of neighbor, a caring and active, engaged regard for the well-being of the other, especially the poor. The last slide, I think, is very moving, where the impacts are being felt is among some of the poorest people in the world who don't have access to our systems, our resources, our education systems, and other things. So I'm just struck by, but at the level of education, it's reaching to the heart. It's beyond the facts, beyond the data, to caring, I think. You've really put your finger on that in a very challenging way, and I wonder if you wanted to just reflect any further on that.
I often hear people say, well, we have the imminent risks of global hunger, of water shortages, of conflict and violence around the world, of disease. So, climate change is important, but let's put it over here for now, and let's deal with the urgent situations first. The problem with that is that we cannot fix the fact that there is not enough food to go around in some parts of the world. We cannot fix the issue that people don't have access to clean water, or public health care, or a secure environment in which to live and raise their families. We cannot fix these problems if we leave climate change out of the picture. And the way I picture it, the image that I use, is a picture of a bucket. We're pouring all of our money and effort into a bucket to try to fix global health issues, for example. Climate change is punching holes in that bucket faster than we can fill them. We're not going to be able to fix these problems if we leave climate change out of the picture. Thank you.
Preston.
Well, I'd like to commend you for not just your talk tonight, but for your general efforts to try to reconcile science and faith. I think the political culture in the United States tends to encourage polarization. It's the nature of the political culture. Maybe that message will be a little bit better received in Canada here, because we're not quite so inclined. We're always groping for the middle way. Why did the Canadian cross the road to get to the middle? And it seems to me you fit in with that. I find that when I deal with faith-based audiences, my inclination is to start with the faith commitments that people have and then work to the science rather than the other way around. Like, if you are a committed Christian, you should be committed to creation care. We're told in Genesis to look after the garden. We're committed, we should be committed to the care of other people, particularly the vulnerable. We should be committed to constraining our consumption, because Jesus said, guard against greed, because life does not consist of the abundance of possessions. And we should be committed to the ministry of reconciliation, because that's the heart of the Christian faith. And it seems to me that you, particularly on that fourth point, are practicing the ministry of reconciliation. And the model we have is Jesus in that sense, who, for one thing, he incorporated both sides of the conflict. He incorporated God, he incorporated man. He communicated with both sides. He took abuse from both sides. And he ended up sacrificing his own interest in order to reconcile people. So I think you're a good example of the ministry of reconciliation, and that you're doing it after the pattern of Christ.
Thank you.
Thank you. Peter.
Thanks, Rory. You know, 7 years ago, when I joined the David Suzuki Foundation, if someone had told me I'd be sitting on a panel with Preston Manning, the president of Regent College, and a Christian climate scientist, I likely would have laughed. But they might have fired me. David might have fired me. But I want you to think and hold that snapshot for a moment, because in that picture is a glimpse of the way forward that we're all going to talk about eventually. And that's this notion that it's really going to be the unusual conversations, the unusual comings together, that connection that Katharine refers to as that convergence of values, what Michael Mann refers to as the convergence of ethics. I've heard him speak with you. So you begin to see some of that way forward. And I like to think that I go out and talk to unusual audiences, not that you're an unusual audience, as often as I can. And in fact, the longer I'm in this area of trying to speak, I want to go and engage people that don't agree with me. Because if I engage people that agree with me, I can't change anything. But my work pales in comparison to yours, Katharine. I just want to pick up on one point that Katharine had mentioned. That was this notion that as a human species, we're going to have to face this combination of options that involve mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. You heard her say that. And then you heard her say that the information was that we're going to have to do a little bit of each, and really the question is, what is the mix that we're going to do? And if you think about it, as a species, of those three options, the one that we probably choose the most is adaptation. We don't do that very well. The other two are much more remote. And by the way, I like to think of mitigation and adaptation, it's equal to thinking about a fire inspector and a firefighter. We really don't like fire inspectors because they come in and tell us to do something and they have regulations and my gosh, it's going to cost something. We love firefighters. They're heroic, they put out fires, they rescue kids and kittens. I mean, what's not to like? But in that story is this hard wiring that we have as a species. We are really good at responding and reacting, not so much on preventative. Even when our self-interest would say that prevention would be the best way to go. And a small illustration, if I can. So likely everybody in this room, I would guarantee, has come to this theater tonight, and you probably are predisposed to agree with everything that Katharine has said. Wait for it. I can also virtually guarantee that, that you're not aligned on the single most important impact that we can have on climate change in this region at this moment in time, and that is to vote yes on the transit referendum that's underway right now. Well, maybe I screwed up on that. But I know, because I'm one of the co-chairs, that it's a horrible campaign. It's just like unbelievable that we're down to pitting people in this region against each other over issues that have nothing to do with the single biggest issue that can mitigate climate change, which is to have improved transportation. And instead we're looking at other issues. And it comes back to that suffering point, because if we can't grapple with this suffering, I really have some difficulties thinking about the bigger issues that Katharine's talking about. Because the only suffering that we would face if we voted yes is 35 cents a day for a decade or more. That's it.
Brilliant. And an awesome segue. Katharine ended her talk with this world map of showing the results of our consumption and our generation of CO2 and sending it up into the atmosphere. And we're left with sort of, what do we do now? And, is it all compact fluorescents and Priuses? And,
LEDs now.
Yeah, LEDs, right, LEDs. Never mind those compact fluorescents. Can't throw them away. There's things that we need to do as individuals, and there are things we need to do as members of civil society. And, the representation we have sort of across the panel is different sectors and different ways that we can influence and be involved. So maybe we'll start again with you, Jeff. What can we do? Where do you see us going?
Yeah, no, very, very good. I think this panel is actually an interesting representation in that what we would hope to see on an issue like this is a kind of coalition of people around a set of common values of caring for the planet and caring for our next generation. And I just think that we should reflect further on what it would mean to, in a sense, mobilize a coalition that crosses different religious commitments, religious communities, with others that don't particularly come to this from a faith-based perspective, but share a common value around the kind of compassion, empathy, longer-term thinking. I wonder whether some of you here, or Preston, has an example of how that kind of coalition could come together, or has come together, that we could learn from. Because to mobilize along those lines, I think, will be critical to addressing all of this. And then the question I, in a sense, have for Katharine is how much time do we have? You don't give us the impression that we have very much time, but coalition building takes time. Education takes time. Political movement takes time. How much time do we have to sort of draw together like-minded people of common concern to galvanize activity?
Which answer do you want first?
Well,
A short one, whatever.
whichever you wish.
The question of time is a really tough one. And it's one that we scientists get asked all the time. How many tons of carbon are safe? By what year do we have to make a decision? When is it too late? My colleague Michael Mann, who you referred to earlier, just wrote a piece in Scientific American 2 months ago where he picked 2036 as the year at which we pass dangerous thresholds. But again, that's not science, that's a value judgment. So all I can say as a scientist is every year that passes without meaningful carbon reductions across Canada and across the world, as are already occurring here in BC today, every year that passes increases the risks. Every year that passes means more people will suffer. The impacts will be harsher. The mitigation will be tougher. Every year puts us one step further down that path. And so in that sense, the only answer I can give is the sooner the better.
Preston, how about maybe from a political point of view, our engagement with folks in government?
Well, I think eventually economics has to be brought to bear. I actually started out in university at physics, but I couldn't handle the math, so I went into economics. I subscribe to this basic principle, and I try and get particularly conservative-oriented, market-oriented people to subscribe to it, that for every economic activity, there are negative environmental consequences. We should determine what those are, rely on science to determine what those are, and what the cost of measures to mitigate or avoid them would be. And we should incorporate the cost of those mitigative or avoidance measures into the price of the product. Yeah. In other words, use pricing mechanisms and if you're dealing with an audience that's skeptical about climate change or carbon pricing and that, and start somewhere else then. That principle can apply to garbage, it can apply to industrial waste, it can apply to water shortage, it can apply to traffic congestion, but get that principle inculcated and practiced. And I think that's one of the economic solutions to the problem. The other, I would stress, and this is where I think the faith community has a unique role to play. I see a lot of the so-called solutions to the environmental problems, including global warming, are on the supply side. If we had the better technology, if we had better cars, if we had, we use wind towers or whatever. Not many people are working on the demand side. That we have this insatiable appetite for goods and services, which is what's driving this whole thing. And there's not a lot of people talking about the self-sacrifice that is required to constrain demand. And that's where the faith community.
Well, first of all, I'm a social scientist. I'm not a climate scientist. So I look at issues of human behavior and motivation and those sorts of things. And And I love what Preston said. I am absolutely aligned on the issues of pricing, and particularly his calls about putting a price on the bads but not the goods. I think that's an important way forward. But I want to pick up on something else, and that's that human dimension side. I like the way that Katharine, so I'm bouncing off what you said there, I like the way that Katharine weaves the issue of values into this discussion. And I've read some of her other material and looked at some of her other videos that she's done. And she also weaves in this notion of scale, this notion of local scale. And when I put those two pieces together, so personal sort of scale, personal values, it equates to something for me that I call agency. And a lot of us know what agency is. Agency is really the act, it's the ability of an individual to act independently and make their own choices. I like agency. The problem with climate change is it's one of these issues, these complex issues that's it's way out in time, and it's not near me, it's somewhere else on the planet. And frankly, I've been told that anything I do is not going to make a difference. It's irrelevant to and inconsequential to the outcome of climate change. The problem with that, as soon as you develop that tendency to think that way, you develop a level of hopelessness. Hopelessness leads to an inability to act. And in fact, we delegate our agency to somebody else, usually government. Governments don't do a very good job at dealing with climate change. And then we end up with this sort of morass that we end up right now. So what I advocate as part of this solution, in addition to the economics and the faith, is this notion that individuals actually have to get re-engaged on this. They can't delegate this to somebody else, government or business or environmental organizations. They need to practice this at the level that I like to call where they live, work, play, and yes, pray, and make those decisions themselves. Now, that could mean different things to anybody, but as Katharine has also shown through some of her slides and in her talk, you end up with, at that level, you end up with lots of innovation, lots of ideas. You get lots of things going on, and nothing will help us get out of this morass than the sense that there's momentum, that there's excitement, that solutions exist and we can do something about it. So, and by the way, the failure to do this because we believe that governments are ultimately responsible, or that we end up in arguments as to which is the perfect solution, because that's often what happens, is that we end up with a paralysis that we're waiting for that perfect solution. Remember Voltaire's quote, "The perfect is the enemy of the good." I have a question for you, though, Katharine, and it's, I've heard the answer, so I know what it is, but the audience hasn't. So you've heard my concept of agency, personal agency. How do you square that with the sovereignty of God?
Settle in.
Yeah. And I've been told we have about 40 minutes to answer that question. That is a great question, because down south of the border, that is the number one question that you hear, or I shouldn't say question, I should say statement, that you hear not just from people in pews, that you hear from people on the Hill, political leaders, including heads of committees of science and technology. People who make decisions about NASA, about satellites, about Earth observing systems. People who make these decisions are saying the arrogance of humans to suggest that we could usurp the sovereignty of God in altering the climate of our planet. The reality is both scientific and theological. Theologically, when we look at the very beginning of the Bible in Genesis, it tells us some important things about our perspective on the world. And one of the most important things there is the perspective that God gave this world to us to be responsible for every living thing on this planet. So we are not usurping the role of God, we are failing to meet our responsibilities in caring for every living thing, which includes humans as well as animals and plants and everything else. The second thing we know, though, is that we make choices all the time that have consequences. We know, and I'm sure, not pointing any fingers here, but I'm sure we've all made a choice that we regret that has had consequences that we did not want. We've been given that freedom, and we know that climate change is literally a consequence of choices we began hundreds of years ago without knowing what the consequences were going to be at that time. But today we know what they are, and today it's time to do something different.